Last Saturday, we were talking about the definition of attitudes, which is a specific one, and its relationship with behavior. I posed the question, as commonly done in this unit, whether one attitude shaped behavior or whether you thought behavior shaped attitudes. And we discussed and agreed on the findings in social psychology that, of course, it works both ways. Um, in regards to attitudes shaping behaviors, which is the most intuitive way of explaining the relationship between the two, we spoke about persuasion, about the intention of changing or any method used to changing the attitude in another person with the assumption that by changing their attitude, they will change their behavior consequently. Um, so, for instance, if I am campaigning for a particular candidate, I will try to persuade and work with the marketing or the campaign department in charge of convincing people to vote for their candidate. I will first appeal to their attitudes, convince them to have either to build a positive attitude towards that agrees with what I'm trying to persuade in them, the message I'm trying to convey with them, and then to expecting that because they have changed that attitude towards a positive one, that they will vote accordingly towards for my candidate. So, well, you can refer to your textbook and to the class and to the notes of your classmates if you didn't make it for those two. There are two types of persuasion. Now, it's time to talk about how behaviors shape attitudes. And there is this consensus that actually this relationship is more powerful, that our behaviors actually shape our attitudes. And we're going to talk about three specific phenomena here, which is the foot in the door technique or phenomenon. We're also going to talk about role playing, and we're going to talk about cognitive dissonance as three very important concepts in social psychology that illustrate and demonstrate how what we do affects how we think. The first one, as we said, is the foot in the door phenomenon. So the first phenomena that again illustrates this relationship between behavior shaping our attitudes or what we do, shaping what we think, is the foot in the door phenomenon. And this is quite an interesting one. It's an influence technique or compliance technique, meaning that people use this intentionally to to get people to do what otherwise they wouldn't, or perhaps at the moment they haven't been convinced that it is the right thing to do or that it's beneficial, etc. You get the point. So it's an influence technique based on the following idea. If you want someone to do a large favor for you, get him or her to do a small favor first. Once they have complied, once they have followed through with that first small favor, then um, we will be more likely, or that person will be more likely to comply with a second, larger, significant one. One that, and I underline this, one large favor that most likely we would have not complied with had we not done that first, had we not complied with the first smaller favor. So again, I repeat, the foot in the door involves several steps. And it is first, let's say I want another person to do something for me. So step number one, I will ask that person to do a small favor for me. Second step, that person accepts and complies, meaning follows through with with that favor. Sorry. Third step, then I request a much larger favor that is, in a way, consistent or has to do with, colloquially saying, with that first favor. And we'll talk about this later. Then, fourth and last step is that person will most likely follow through. Now, I have to add, or we have to add and be very clear on this, in that the foot in the door phenomenon is also sort of its center is the fact that we wouldn't. The second favor is one that we, or the second task is one that we wouldn't do had we not been asked that first step first, or the first favor first. So please be very clear on the steps of this foot in the door phenomena, or what it involves. As your textbook, I'm not going to spend much time in this, but your textbook talks about how this was used during the Korean War. Apparently, a technique used by the communist Chinese when they had these prisoners from war, and they actually convinced the prisoners, the American prisoners, um, to do things for them. And they didn't use force, actually. Word has it that they didn't even employ like torture techniques. In fact, what they did was they would ask them to let's say to write something in favor of communism. And of course, these American soldiers would write it because they would think that they had no other option. So they would ask him, so they would say, write something positive about communism. And then they would ask them moments later or days later to write a self-reflection and to more self-criticism and to criticize capitalism. And then they would ask them to do very small tasks, sort of, to take one, to as a messenger, to take this, to send something and come back, or very, very innocuous actions. And then what ended up happening is that many prisoners of war, American prisoners of war, actually, some of them stayed under communism. um, I'm not sure whether it was in North Korea, or which is not what now we know as North Korea, or in China, but they preferred to stay in a communist society. They did not return, and others, the majority of them, did return, but actually sympathized with communism, or at the let's say at the lightest, they uh, would understand communism in a complete, hold some positive beliefs for it. So again, this is a very powerful psychological technique that can be used in brainwashing. It has been used in cults. We'll talk a little bit about that. Is to first to get that person to do something very small, and then sort of up the ante, and if most likely they will comply. In a less dramatic or less, let's say, meaningful way, um, you teenagers use this a lot. I remember I say this based on my personal experience with Chiz. We might tend to, we perhaps will ask our parents whether we can, I don't know, hang out with a friend. And then once they allow us to hang out with a friend, then we call them later on and say, "Oh, could I actually? My friend is going to a party, and can I go with him? I did a plan to come with him, but now that I'm here, can I go now? And then can I go with him or her? And then that will be, um, sort of a larger task. And then once they agree, then they will ask you, well, why don't you come back? Make sure to be back home at, I don't know, midnight. And then you tell them, well, can I? Or later on, you would sort of up the ante a little bit more and say, well, I would like to be later. Can I come back later after midnight? And you get the point as to how this can be used, and also in more daily interactions. So one of the first scientific tests to examine the foot in the door technique was actually a very clever design by Friedman and Fraser in I believe 1996. No, was it 1996? I could be wrong with that one. I feel that this was much earlier. Anyway, they had this researcher go to, and this is actually an experiment because they had, remember the requirement of an experiment, guys? Random assignment. So they had a researcher go door to door It's actually very interesting. They had this researcher go door to door in California. Well, I think it was Palo Alto, I believe. I have something. I'll confirm that in a minute. And ask, basically, they would ask homeowners to whether they could put a small sign in their window that said "Be a safe driver." That was their supposedly their campaign. They were working as activists or campaigners for safe driving. And why, why would anyone say no to such a very, very small request, right? So think about it for a minute. Who's against safe driving? Now, little did these homeowners, people realize that by saying yes to that small request would make them be more receptive to a larger request. And this was 2 weeks later. So the large request was made by, I think it was by different or the same agent. I think it should have been by the same who approached each house and then or different. Now I'm doubting that. Well, anyway, this second request, this large request, asked the homeowners permission after they had accepted to put the small sign to put a large, very large, ugly sign. It was this very, I don't know, ugly sign in the lawn that said "Drive carefully." Of course, it's related to that smaller one that was a small sign in their window. And and Friedman and Fraser knew that most homeowners wouldn't want a large, ugly sign in their lawns because when they made this request to a different set of homeowners, those who hadn't been asked previously, only 17% said yes. But when they made this request to the homeowners who had agreed 2 weeks earlier to put a small "Be a safe driver" sign in their windows, 76 said yes. So again, that was 17% versus those homeowners that hadn't been requested previously for that small favor versus 76%. This selection was actually they were randomly assigned. I mean, we have the control condition, right? Those who weren't asked previously, and we have the experimental condition, those who had been gone through this first and had accepted this first previous request and had complied with it. So think about it. That's, if I'm not mistaken, that foot in the door phenomenon or technique caused an increase or difference in compliance of, like over 300%. So this is the powerful use of this compliance technique or phenomenon. So next on our list on how behaviors can influence or shape attitudes is role playing. So to better understand, or to first, before we begin discussing how role playing can affect our attitudes or the way we think, we first need to have a very clear idea. And these two concepts are a little bit tricky, but I'll try my best and we can talk about it later. But social roles are the definition of social roles and social norms. So first of all, we play different roles throughout our social lives, right? You guys might wake up as a son or a daughter, and in that situation, in that social situation within your family, and you will have sort of, what is, you already know what behavior is expected of you. Then you arrive to poly. You have the role of the student. You have the role of the athlete. You have the role within your different group of friends. And trust me, even if you are that type of person who has several group of friends, who hangs out with different types of people, you might understand or you might know what I'm talking about when I say that each group has a set of expectations of you. And you play a role in that group. Sometimes memberships to groups are more, let's say, less clearly defined. I was explaining in class that I consider myself member of an intellectual group, and I also consider myself of being a group of Latinos in general, or Latino men, and fathers. And based on what role I am playing, meaning being at a particular moment in a social situation, there is a certain set of expectations of me. So, and just to give you a clear example of how social roles determine behavior or what is expected of you, You might understand. It's interesting how students sometimes think of teachers as people who, who are very boring, who, they basically live at school, and if they have a life outside school, it's like, I don't know, in a library reading books. And I know it's not that, harsh. Hopefully not, but and not that it's, not that it's super exciting. But that has more to do with adulthood and to having children and everything. But um, so for students, sometimes, let's say, if a student sees Mr. Sarkos, let's say, in a karaoke bar, right? So, and me sort of, hanging out with my friends, having a drink or two, and then just, singing, for students, it might be, wait a minute, this is just too awkward for me. I can't believe I saw this. It seems, for most of you, it might be even more magnified, like a very special thing and something that's sort of out of this world. Why? Because that behavior is not expected of somebody who has the role in which you see me on a daily basis. So again, you see me every day as a teacher. And teachers, you have a set of expectations of teachers, or we all do, which is, we have to be sort of proper. We have to, not have fun, or we have to behave in particular ways. And then which go, of course, according to our schema or a prototype of what a teacher, how a teacher should behave and carry themselves. So having fun with friends and singing and making a fool out of yourself, not that I ever do that, but that sort of does not correspond with the expectations that you have of me or that you have of a teacher. But it does go, for me, it does is appropriate. I can't be a teacher in hanging out with my friends. I wouldn't have friends. So that sort of, I hope, because I understand that my role at that moment is to be a friend or to be hanging out with my, I don't know, high school or college friends. Then social norms are also interesting. These are unwritten or unspoken of, as the slide says, and usually they go hand in hand with the role we have at a particular moment, and the norms are the rules themselves. So you might have a group of friends where and these are very subtle. I used to have, we'll talk about that in class later on. I used to have this project in breaking social norms. You had to break a social norm. And these norms, well, the videos were funny and everything, but they were just too sort of too out there, too obvious, I guess the term is. But I challenge students every year when I assign this project, sorry, because it's actually quite fun. We just ran out of time. But I would assign students, let's say, to um, I don't know what happened. What would happen if, speaking more here to the male students, what would happen if among your group of friends, not your best friend, to among your group of friends, your buddies at school, if you showed up one day with some flowers and carrying some flowers and saying, you know what, guys, I kind of realized yesterday that I fell in love. And today I am going to declare and express my love to this person. And how would that go? You see, that type of social norm for me is more interesting. And breaking, or what they call in sociology and psychology, breaching a social norm, the whether or not that is a social norm in your group of friends, you would know it by breaching it and their reaction. If there is rejection, or if there, which can come in many forms, I'm not saying necessarily this friendship needs to end or your group membership needs to end, but if they react in a surprising way and they are comfortable with that, I mean, think about it. You're just simply saying that you love somebody else. Yet your group might have this unspoken rule that that is not allowed. So I invite you just to think for a moment about these very subtle rules that your group membership to a group of friends has, and that you've never spoken about them, but you know there are rules, or perhaps they are not, but you would have to breach them to find out. Zimbardo. Zimbardo's famous experiment. You might have watched the movie. If you haven't, I truly recommend it. Apparently, it's very, I haven't watched it actually. Maybe it's because I read so much about this experiment, but it's actually very interesting. Zimbardo, this wasn't the whole purpose of the study, but one of the studies, one of the most important findings of it, it's very controversial. You're going to watch a video in a minute of it, but I wanted to tell you is that one of the main takeaways from this very infamous study is that the power that social roles as sort of an environmental factor of a situation can have in the way we think and the way we behave. Um, you see, social norms and social roles play a role. It's sort of demonstrated the power when we enact new roles. Like think about the first day of school, of high school when you arrive to poly. Maybe you don't remember. I think you do, but maybe you're sort of changing that memory. But I'm sure most of you, if not all, were looking around to see what people were doing or not. For those of you who had been in poly before, in the middle school, yes, perhaps there was a little less of this because you had more information at your hands. But you were also sort of realizing, okay, you were thinking, going back and forth, well, I'm no longer a middle schooler, so what are things that high schoolers do that middle schoolers don't, or what do I have to stop doing, stop bringing, stop wearing because now I'm a high schooler? You were trying to figure out define your role so that you could follow along, and also you were looking at social norms around you. For instance, something as subtle as carrying a tray. I hear that there was a time in which trays were not used because they were considered dorky or something like that at poly. I'm talking because I've heard this from other classes in the past. So once you reach to high school, you no longer use a tray. And if you break that norm, they're going to see what is the price to pay is that people will see you as the outsider, the dorky one, the I don't know, you name it. This happens in many parts of life. Also, the power of enacting a new role. And the reason why I emphasize new and why the studies emphasize new is because whenever we are in a situation that we are unfamiliar with, we are going to rely on something, and write this down, social scripts, which is basically what people in particular roles need to do, but that we get from the media. Mostly social script we get from the media. So in this case, you're going to see the power that social scripts, type of social norms, and social roles had in changing the behavior and the attitudes of the people, of the participants of the study. Keep that in mind as you watch and as I ask you questions throughout that video. Up until now, we've studied social cognition, or this phenomena that refers to social cognition more importantly, and it's a process that occurs more within us. It's how we think about the other, how we explain their behavior, how do we adjust our own behavior. Now, with social influence, is basically how is it that all of us are prone to particular processes, the ones we're going to study in this part of the unit, that change our behavior. What is a common pattern that all of us go through when in a group that happens, and that we all go through a similar process of adjusting our behavior, but this is now a process that's coming from outside and affecting us, if that makes some sense. And for the purpose of organizing your notes, under this social influence subset of study, we will review automatic mimicry, explaining your textbook, conformity, and obedience. I'm just going to try to provide additional information that I think is important for the exam. But before we begin to identify each of these social influence concepts or phenomena that are explained in your textbook, I'd like to add to its relevance by explaining the power of cults, and specifically the power of people's temple. A very tragic story that your parents might sure know about. So imagine for a minute that somebody, a leader of a group, would ask you to kill your family, to kill your friends, and all people around you. Now, I'm sure all of us would react in the same way and would say that's impossible. There's no way. I would say the guy's nuts. I would, the guy is crazy. And I would never, I can't understand somebody who would be able to do such a thing. And I agree. Um, so, well, this actually, I'm starting by the end of the story, is how a tragedy that occurred in 1977 began. Reverend Jones, he was a very charismatic leader. He began in the early 70s to have these sort of worked in several churches in LA. I believe he alternated between LA and Northern California. I don't remember exactly where in Northern California. But because of what he called this paranoia, what he called the religious persecution from the U.S. government, he moved all his congregates. Would that be correct? Or his followers within. Well, he of course didn't call it cult, nor did the members, but he moved his cult members, all the followers, all the way down to in South America, in Guyana, what he established as called Jonestown. So you can see a little bit the narcissism there from its leader. Um, and this was a huge problem. This was covered in the media a lot. Think about this for a minute. I mean, these were not people that were sort of not educated. It did. I mean, some of them actually had college backgrounds, had very successful lives, and accepted this move. Now, this move involved to sell your property, to donate the earnings, I believe, or most of them, to the People's Temple, and many people did this, and they went along. He promised that I think he even mentioned it was a commune, that it was going to be a paradise. And I believe that soon after they arrived and began building these houses, they began realizing that it was just the plan, or the execution of the plan was not sustainable, or did not make it sustainable to live in the jungle of Guyana, where this supposed paradise commune it was promised by him, by Reverend Jones. So under these very hostile or harsh circumstances, in which people, even followers, even after being brainwashed to be part of a cult, which is why I bring this up, this brainwashing process we're going to talk later, they began feeling, I mean, apparently stories of abuse began to emerge, and the followers or cult members sort of saw that this was not the way it was supposed to go. Something was strange. They were hearing these stories of abuse, and it was just a bad place to be in, and they began writing back home. Um, and in fact, many people wanted to just escape. But as the leader, Reverend Jones became more paranoid. He was more threatening to its members of People's Temple, and and really becoming sort of this dangerous figure, threatening to those who did not give him his questionable support and loyalty to this group. And this all it became increasingly, more disastrous, to the point that he would preach. Now, remember, he's a reverend. He would preach for hours about this coming judgment day, and that he expected loyalty from its members, to when this day came, to conduct this sort of group um, suicide drill, to be prepared for this coming day. And I have to be very clear that these preparations for this mass suicide, came with these drills that they would do. I don't know exactly how they would, but think about foot in the door effect. And I'm sure this was sort of a simulation or role playing simulation of what he expected his followers to do later on, which is the big news in 1979 or something like that. What ended up being, in fact, a mass suicide. Leo Ryan, at the time, a California congressman, um, at the request of family members who had received word that of all these things going on in Jonestown, he actually traveled to Jonestown, Guyana, to sort of investigate um, these alleged circumstances and events. And the congressman travels, arrives, and at first, apparently, he was very much welcome. But then, shortly after, they begin to notice, including the congressman, that the visit wasn't that welcome and it was mostly orchestrated. So apparently, story goes that I know a lot about cults since I've researched them a lot. They begin slipping messages to him. The members of the group of People's Temple in saying, you know, we are held here against our will. Please save us. And then when it was time to leave, um, Leo Ryan and his group, his contingent group, sort of left and were on their way to the airport. And actually, the members of People's Temple, ordered by Reverend Jones, actually killed most people in the group, if not all, including Leo Ryan, the congressman. Of course, people were going to find out, law enforcement and intelligence agencies and family members were going to find out that this happened. So, for in the mind of Reverend Jones, this meant, or what he told his followers was that this judgment day was coming very soon, and he actually assembled all his followers to for one last suicide drill, quote unquote. Only that this time it wasn't a drill. This time was, you know, a real suicide act. So the instructions were very clear. He had this, in fact, it became known as Kool-Aid. People who referred to the story referred to this Kool-Aid, but it looked like Kool-Aid, this drink. So there was, I think, this tub in the middle, and he would ask people to. The instructions were again were very clear. Adults were first to give this. I think it was cyanide that this water had. First to give the drink to their children, and then to drink it themselves. And then he, in fact, called it this revolutionary suicide, what he called, and basically everyone would die following his instructions. So he instructed them to take this drink, and here is when I ask everyone to think for a minute: what would you do in this circumstance? And of course, we know what we would all say. We would stand up, say no, impossible. But then, over 900 people, including, I believe, close to 300 children, died on this day. I forget the exact date, but it was November 1978, following shortly after the visit of Leo Ryan. Again, over 900 people did actually commit this suicide. And so it leaves us with this question: what would we do? And would we? I mean, were these people simply all of them coincidentally happened to be gathered and to be mentally ill? To sort of were they brainwashed by this charismatic leader, or are we? For a second, let's just consider: are we more susceptible to the influence of others and to the power of the social influence than what we might want to think? This is something to keep in mind as we go through these different different social influence phenomena. The first one is automatic mimicry. And automatic mimicry is basically, as you read on the slide, this it's unintentional and unconscious imitation of other people's accents or speech patterns or postures, gestures, mannerisms, moods or emotions. And I'm actually fall very prone to this, but I'm very proud of it, and I'll explain why. Because people, I don't know if it happens to some of you, but when you are with people with other accents, and it happens to me in English and in Spanish, when I am speaking to people from, I don't know, from Argentina or from Colombia, it's just it's more powerful than me. trust me, and I begin speaking like them. Whenever I go to Houston, Texas, and I say I have a lot of family down there, and I begin speaking like that. I mean, for those that are not on my Venezuelan part of the family. And again, it's something my wife says that I'm full of what, that it's that she thinks it's very disrespectful, that they're going to think that I'm making fun of them. But I actually, there's something about me that I can't control it. And this is basically automatic mimicry. Now, of course, it's on a spectrum in the sense that there are, I guess, there are people that are more prone to this, that find it more of a need to do, and others less so. Now, is it good, bad, or both? Actually, whenever my wife tells me that I shouldn't be doing that, I actually tell her, you know what? You should actually be appreciative that I do this automatically, because it has been shown, or there is sufficient evidence to demonstrate a very clear relationship in between the how powerful of an experience of automatic mimicry each of us has, and empathy, meaning that it says that I have a lot of empathy, which is not surprising, right, guys? So anyway, but it's also tied with mood linkage, a term that is explained in your textbook, and it's this tendency we all have, again, to different degrees, each of us as individuals, to to absorb the main prevailing mood that is around us. And as your textbook, I think, explains, or I don't remember it, but no, it doesn't. But this is mood leakage when you experience it. Let's say you're in a bad mood, you're in a foul mood, you woke up, or it was one of those days, terrible days, and you end up meeting your friends at school, um, and then they are not in a bad mood, and they don't even have to try to cheer you up. They're just in a different mood. Well, I don't know if that's happened to you, that you end up actually lightening up throughout the day. You are absorbing that prevailing mood. If most of your friends are in a good mood and you're the only one sort of feeling down in the dumps, actually it elevates you somewhat. Now, again, this doesn't happen all the time, and this would be, some of us are more prone to this effect than others. But there is, it also, I think it's called contagion. And it is that idea that, which is why when people, perhaps someone sees you sad, or you see another person sad, and you tell them, let's go to, I don't know, let's go meet with so and I'm sure you're going to feel better after it. Think about that. And as people trying to cheer us up, or we try to cheer somebody else up, and that is because there is reality to that. There is data that can support that mood linkage is going to change our mood to the prevailing one. Remember, it's the prevailing one. So there's a difference here. So automatic mimicry, also called chameleon effect, is us imitating others with gestures, accents, the way they speak, and then this explains, as automatic mimicry, as you see, involves the the term mood right there. Sorry for that's tied to mood linkage. It includes this that we're also going to absorb or imitate unintentionally and unconsciously the moods of others. You're going to watch a video in which you're going to, and your reading is pretty clear, on the impact of Solomon Asch in social psychology. Very, very important to have that name. You have to associate it with his conformity line experiment. I'm just telling you right now. Solomon Asch's conformity to experiments, of course, study the phenomena, the social psychology phenomena of conformity. And remember, conformity is what is conformity? It basically involves changing our beliefs, our behavior in order to fit in with a group. Again, I'll repeat that. We conform when we change, adjust our belief or behavior so that it matches with the group that we are in a particular moment. Um, as I say, I will provide you each with the power of conformity, the reading that is indicated in that slide. You will see better in the video, but the The design is pretty simple. You are asked to attend an experiment. It is all set so that you are the only participant truly, and all the other ones are Confederates. Remember, in research methods, Confederates are basically actors pretending to be participants. So you are the participants, all the others are Confederates. And the experimenter passes one is going to ask questions, and very simple for you to match whether lines A, B, C match so you have one line on one side and A, B, and C on the other, which one matches the original line. And the first couple, I believe, first 2 or 3 rounds are pretty simple. And they ask, and they sit you in a strategically so that 4 or 3 people are going to answer before you. And they ask everyone in the setting. They ask, okay, so which one do you think A, B, or C matches the original line? And the first participant responds, and the second and the third, right? So then what happens is that, and the video is really compelling because you can see the person really struggling with trying to. So the first one's, pretty simple. Everyone answers the same thing. But then on a fourth intent, a fourth different slide, actually other people begin to actually provide the wrong answer. And the person, you as a participant, are like, wait a minute, am I seeing right? I mean, I see a different line that matching the original one. And for me, it's C, or I don't know what other letter. And then it came your turn. What would you say? Would you say what you're seeing is truth? Yeah, I'm sure most of you would say yes. Actually, and it's important to mention, not everyone did. I mean, most people actually, yeah, went with their own individual opinion, estimation, and said, yeah, the line, it's not, I don't know what these guys are talking about. They wouldn't say that, but I don't know what they're talking about, but the correct line is B, not C, or A, not B. But 1/3 did conform, meaning they adjusted their behavior to that of those members in the group. So you're going to see more in the video about this and answer questions. It's a very important study. You will for sure have a question about it on the AP exam. Now, think about this. They did several variations, of course, controlling for different variables. And in this setting, in the classic one, let's say, of Solomon Asch's study on conformity, you had to provide your answer in public, meaning while everyone, after everyone else, but you had to verbalize it and everyone else was hearing. He did many, many changes to this experiment to evaluate different variables and change different sort of, yeah, to evaluate different variables and how they would influence. And, while 1/3, that's 33%, right? Yeah, 33% conformed to the wrong answer when they felt the pressure. Only 5% did when they had to answer when they had to respond in private, meaning I think they would provide an envelope or something like that instead of saying it, the response. So with these variations of the design, he concluded, and these are very important to have for our exam and for the AP, is to have under what circumstances is conformity higher than in others. And he goes through when the answer is unanimous, meaning no other else is dissenting. But if you have one dissenter in the group, most likely then conformity weakens, and we are more, it's more likely that we will provide the correct answer, the one we're seeing. If self-esteem is low, apparently has an effect to what degree we conform. Um, Sort of external locus of control. Remember that if we are that type of person that think that our fate is determined by external factors, the bad luck or everything goes wrong no matter what I do, then most likely we would conform. The group status and level of attraction, meaning if they are attractive, both in personality or in looks too. If we respect the group, meaning if they hold a high status also in terms of intelligence, being smart, or reputation. And the more similar we all are to the group too, we will conform more. Your textbook also explains, I think there are some different here, but please understand this idea of the factors under which conformity is stronger than in others. Conformity is very powerful, and it involves, it is actually, I'm sure if maybe you've heard about the copycat phenomenon, which is when there are murders. There's this sort of social phenomena that occurs because of conformity that people feel more inclined to murder, and more cases of murders begin to emerge in a particular area. Your textbook explains a very quintessential example of this, which is of how dangerous this could be with Columbine school shooting. Right after a school shooting, I think in a period of, I don't know, a particular number of months, I believe one maybe, every state in the United States reported a case of possible school shooting. Now, the most important part here is, why do we do it? Why do we conform? And Solomon Ash's line experiment, again, this guy did many, I think thousands of people participated in them. What he found is that we conform because of one due to one or mainly one of two reasons. Normative social influence, we conform when we want to fit in, or we conform when we want to avoid rejection. Has the normative social influence, we conform due to our need to belong to a group, and we want to belong. We don't want to be rejected. In informational social influence, we conform because we don't know what to do, and we look around and we say, what is everyone else doing? Or more specifically, it's defined in your textbook as, when we conform, informational social influence is we conform when we want to be right. And perhaps we don't think we are right, or we doubt that we are right. So we look around and find and assume that the information in the group, or the prevailing information in the group, is the correct one and not ours. There are also social cultural factors. Actually, individualistic, capitalistic societies like the United States, actually people tend to conform less. And that's, I think, hopefully self-explanatory as to why we would see more tendency to conform in collectivist societies. So remember that. You could have a question about geography. Remember, Asian societies, Latin American societies follow more collectivist pattern of culture, and they would be more likely to conform. Um, Now, we move on to the next one. Compliance is when we agree to do something, to follow a request made by somebody else. Now, I have to emphasize a request. In conformity, there was no request for you to say the same thing. We just sort of conform because of our need to belong, or need to be right, but there is no explicit request that tells us to follow through with something, with an action. Compliance, colloquially speaking, here there is a favor that has been stated, that is clear, and we comply, meaning we follow through, we do it. Compliance is not in your textbook, but I've seen plenty of AP exams that ask about it. And I will save you some time, and there's a video, an excellent video of Cialdini, that explains the different techniques for compliance. One of them is the foot in the door technique. Please don't get confused. The first foot in the door is the same thing that we spoke about. Only here, as a compliance technique, it is used much by advertisers and marketers, also as a way for people to do things that otherwise perhaps they wouldn't do, to purchase something otherwise they wouldn't purchase. So all I'm going to say is, please take notes um, carefully. They will be on your social psych exam, and they will be on your AP exam as well. So now this brings us to the third and last phenomenon of social influence, which has to do with obedience. Now, as I asked you before with the Colt and Reverend Jones situation, I'd like you to consider for a minute whether would you ever be capable of harming another person just because an authority told you to do so? And if, or better yet, a question could be, under what circumstances, or what would need to happen for you to follow the orders of somebody that could possibly, include killing somebody, or harming somebody severely? What would need to happen, or what conditions would need to occur for you to comply, to obey to such an order, meaning carrying it out? This is something I would like you to also to answer, because again, our tendency is to first say, well, no, I'm a good person. This goes against my way of viewing life, and to become a little bit more explorative with this. So it's important to understand and to have very clear that obedience is different from conformity and different from compliance. When we talk about conformity, we talk about adjusting our behavior to that one that matches the expectations or the behavior and the way of thinking of the group without anything being mentioned in an explicit way, meaning directly. There is no request to adjust our behavior to the group. When we comply, someone asks us for a favor, and we comply by following through with that favor. We respond positively. So if someone tells us, pass us the salt, and then while eating, and we pass the salt, we have complied to that request. That is compliance. And you reviewed those in that video with Cialdini, and these are not included in your text with Myers. Then finally, we arrive to obedience. And obedience is responding to an explicit demand, not request, demand. Words matter, language teacher here. So it is a direct order, a command from someone in authority. So the difference between this and compliance is that compliance is we go along with a request, whereas in obedience we respond and we carry out a task that is being demanded of us by someone in authority. These can come in the form, as mentioned previously, in the form of instructions, orders, and commands. They can be good, meaning, they keep social order, right? And as someone in the conventional stage of morality might emphasize. And they can also, if the person asking for the request is somebody who is pro-social, who at least has the best interests of people around us, then it could also be a positive thing. Unfortunately, or very fortunately, Stanley Milgram's obsession almost to understand, and if you watch his film, I believe it's The Experimenter, you might understand what obsession I'm talking about. It's actually a mild term for him. He wanted to understand why in Germany it was surrounding the Holocaust, why in Germany so many people were killed just because other people following orders told them to do so. Why did so many people why did ordinary people, as he said, why did ordinary men or ordinary people carry out unthinkable acts? And that's basically the research question of his entire investigations throughout, the most famous one being his obedience studies. Quickly, Milgram is the son of Jewish immigrants. Of course, affected by the Holocaust, they had to move and leave Europe. In 1960, he receives his PhD in social psychology in Harvard, and he was, as I mentioned previously, influenced by the Holocaust. And in the 60s, he is actually a student, he's a student or works for Solomon Asch in conformity studies. And as I said too, he thought that it could be impossible that all these Germans were basically all sociopaths capable of killing people. That there had to be a powerful situational, remember social psychology, had to be a situational force that led them to, or that was mostly responsible for these executions, that led these people to execute so many Jewish people. So now I will present with you a video in which please pay attention to how the setup is what the setup of the study, the design of the research experiment, who is a Confederate, who is a participant, and what are the roles in the experiment, what was the experiment about, and again, over the findings and of course, what occurs during the experiment, what are the orders, and which you need to be familiar with to study for the AP exam, including the number of participants that carried out that were willing to administer or that administered the maximum shock. The percentage wise is also important for all these social psychology studies. And as you might see, Milgram's studies had its findings were very powerful, have shaken the world because of how of providing a very clear yet very difficult reality, and that is that basically, based on his findings, any of us or most of us, under certain circumstances, would be capable of committing atrocities and of killing others just because we are told to do so. And this is very difficult to accept, and we can understand why, as our self-esteem is basically hijacked here for a minute when we think if we are capable of doing such things. I want to finish by illustrating that at the time there were people who thought, the majority of Americans thought that that the Holocaust is something that was particular to Germany. They were horrified, and I guess out of fear, perhaps. Most Americans and most people worldwide thought that this was something particular to Germans. And to the particular unique blend of circumstances, social circumstances that were taking place at the time there. But that this now you can see that how this thesis is very convenient, because it would imply that, as it did, that these type of things, people executing others, innocent people, strangers that they didn't know, that this could occur over there and not over here. So we can see a protective, wishful thinking here. And then, of course, Stanley Milgram among them would at least think that this was not the end of the story, that this could not be a case in which all Germans were sociopaths, or they had this sort of genetic tendency to kill others, that there had to be particular circumstances, again defined by his studies, in which we are going to be more prone to following orders, even if it requires us, even if that at that moment it requires us to commit acts that otherwise we would never even fathom committing. And I think that I think that history sort of tells us the answer to these to both alternatives, and that are consistent with Stanley Milgram's findings. The fact that concentration camps in the United States was impossible, that this was in democratic America, there would be no such thing. And if one looks at the disturbing reality of Japanese internment camps, and if you haven't read anything about this, please do so, because while it didn't have this magnitude of the amount of people that died during the Holocaust, the idea behind it was the same. We deprived, I say we, Americans deprived these people from their basic human rights, were cruel. Many died in these internment camps, didn't have access to basic rights, human rights. And the cruelty of the whole thing is something that I am sure at the least Americans should not feel very proud of. But it was basically concentration camps. And the U.S. support to Latin American dictatorships also, in a way, is as cruel. Acts were as cruel as those committed during the Holocaust as well, by either American soldiers directly or by foreign police forces from Latin America being trained in the U.S. by Americans to execute all these crimes. Abu Ghraib, I always forget how to pronounce it, but this was a prison in Iraq in 2003 when American soldiers were extremely cruel and photographed these Iraqi soldiers naked, abused them in ways, humiliated them in ways, and took photographs. And I believe these soldiers were reprimanded. But this was also very controversial, because we tend to, in the individualistic societies, to think that this is something particular to these soldiers, but we tend to not think about the situational, and this brings us all the way back to the fundamental attribution error. We tend to undermine or to underestimate the power of the situation. Anyway, this is all for obedience. And I know it's been long, but I hope it's been worth it. Thank you.